Now, welcome back to Managerial Accounting. The purpose of this little mini lecture is to review the multiple choice part of the in-class part of the exam number one. And there were 30 questions. Each one was worth 2 points. So the maximum credit you could have gotten here was 60 points. And then each of the problems was worth 10 points. I've already given you the review of the problems. So let's focus in on the multiple choice. So first question, the primary goal of managerial accounting is to provide information that is useful to managers of the company. That's why it's called managerial accounting. It's not primarily focused on investors, creditors, or external auditors. Focus is preparing specialized reports to help managers make decisions. So the answer there is C. Which of the following would likely be considered an indirect material by a manufacturer? Indirect material would be those costs which are difficult. They're in part of the cost of the manufacturing product, but they're difficult to trace to the product. So steel, fabric, and lumber would all be fairly easy to track to a job. Glue would be more difficult to attract. So the best answer there is glue. Cost of goods manufactured is equal to total manufacturing cost plus beginning work in process minus ending work in process. That's how you get total manufacturing costs. So the answer there is D. Which of the following is a period cost for Bartow Corporation, a bicycle manufacturer? Period costs are those costs that do not become part of the cost of the product. So tires for the bicycles, factory supervisor's salary, electricity costs to run the factory, factory supervisor's salary, and indirect electricity costs to run the factory are all factory overhead. Period costs are those costs that do not become part of the cost of the product. So accountant salaries are important, but they're not part of the cost of manufacturing the product. They're not materials, labor, or overhead. So those would be considered a period cost. So D is the best answer here. An example of a period costs are those things that don't become part of the cost of the product. So advertising expense, although important, doesn't become part of the cost of the product, whereas indirect materials depreciation and property taxes on plant facilities, those all become part of the cost of the product. So the correct answer there is A, advertising expense. 6, compute the conversion costs. Conversion costs are the total of labor and overhead. So the total of labor here and overhead is 196,300 plus overhead of 187,900. So you get total overhead of 384,200. Answer there is D. Which of the following is an indirect cost for Bartow Corporation, a producer of bar stools for restaurants? So indirect costs would be, another word for that is overhead, and that's cost that's necessary to manufacture a product, but it's difficult to trace directly to the product. So wages, wood and steel, leather used for seat cushions, those are all fairly easy to trace to the cost of the product. So factory supervisor's salary would be an example of an indirect cost or an overhead cost. So the answer there is B. 8, prime costs are direct material and labor. So that's B. Journalizing the entry for indirect labor costs incurred for general factory use would be debit to factory overhead. So when you incur indirect labor costs, that's one of your many overhead costs. So when you incur overhead costs, you debit the factory overhead account. Which of the following is typically used by companies that make custom products? When you hear custom products, think of job order costing. So the answer there is A. Journalizing the entries for jobs shipped and customers billed would include a credit to finished goods. So remember, we trace materials and labor and overhead to work in process. We transfer work in process to finished goods. And then when we sell the product, we recognize cost of goods sold and reduce to finished goods. So journalize the entries for jobs shipped and customers billed would include a credit to finished goods. The answer there is C. 12, a manufacturer of which of the following products would most likely use job order costing? So job order costing is when you use that when you manufacture specialized orders where each order is different. So a graduation invitation obviously would be different than have a higher level of difference than a cell phone or a highlighter pen or a recliner. Those are all examples of products that you manufacture in large quantities, which are all the same. So the one that would most likely use Job order costing would be a graduation invitation, which would have the individual name of the graduate. 13, in job order costing, the journal entry for the flow of for direct materials to production consists of a debit to work in process and a credit to materials. So in job order costing, when you incur costs, whether they material, labor, and overhead, it's always a debit to work in process. And credits, in this case, a credit to materials because you're using direct materials. 14, the salary of director of internal audit, that would be an indirect, that would be a period cost or administrative expense. It's not directly part of any of those costs that are incurred that are not part of the cost of producing the product are called period costs. So the answer there would be period cost administrative expense. 15, the document authorizing the issuance of materials from the storeroom, that's a materials requisition form. So the answer there is A. The amount of factory overhead incurred exceeds the amount applied. Factory overhead account will have a debit balance and it will be under applied. Remember, you're going to think of a T account with factory overhead. You're going to debit it for the costs incurred and you get credit for the overhead applied. So if you get a debit balance in the account, that means that you've got under applied overhead. So the answer there is A. 17, the following production data were taken from the records for the finishing department for June. So this is the beginning inventory and process completed during the units completed. Ending inventory is 60% complete. The number of conversion equivalent units in the June 30th finished department inventory, assuming the first in, first out method used to cost inventory. So the amount that would be left over in the ending inventory would be 7,000 units times 60%. So they're asking here for number of conversion units. It would be 60% times 7,000, which is 4,200, which is D. 18. Department had 2,400 units, 1/3 completed at the beginning of the period. 16,000 units were transferred to Department X from Department W during the period. 1,800 units were 1/2 completed at the end of the period. Assume that the ratios apply to direct materials and conversion costs. The equivalent units of production used to compute unit conversion cost of production department report for Department W, assuming FIFO. So that's 2,400 units that were 1/3 complete. So 2,400 times 2/3 would be done this period. And then the started and completed would be the 16,000 units were transferred, but of those 2,400 were in beginning work in process. So that would be 16,000 minus 2,400. And then you had the 1,800 units that were 1/2 complete at the end of the period. So 1,800 times 1/2. So that gives you a total of 16,100. And the answer there is A. 19, the manufacture of 10,000 units of a product, materials costs incurred were 165,000. Direct labor incurred was 105 and applied factory overhead. Total conversion cost would be labor plus overhead. So 105 plus 53 gives you 158. In process costing, the amount of work in process inventory is valued by allocating department costs between completed and partially completed units. So the best answer there is B. The other ones are interesting, but they're not amongst the best. Finding the sum of all open job costs doesn't really mean anything. Multiplying the units in ending inventory by the direct materials cost per unit doesn't really mean anything. Finding the sum of all completed jobs. So best answer there, the amount of work in process inventory is valued by allocating department costs completed and partially completed units. So that the answer there is B. 21. Department W had 2,400 units, 1/3 completed at the beginning of the period. 16,000 units were transferred to Department X from Department W during the period. 1,800 units were 1/2 complete at the end of the period. Assumed completion rates applied to direct materials and conversion costs. the total number of direct units to assigned costs. So the total number of direct units to be assigned costs. This is not equivalent units. This is the total number of units would be the 2,400 plus the started and completed, which would be the 16,000 minus the 2,400 that you had to begin with, plus the ending inventory. So the correct answer there is 17,800. So these really are the whole units. These are not the equivalent units for materials and conversion costs. These are the whole units, 17,800. Which of the following would most likely use job order costing? So paper manufacturer, flour mill, and gasoline refinery, you're producing a large number of homogeneous products, so they would likely use process costing. The one that would use job order costing would be a movie studio. Each movie would be different. So the answer there is A. Process costing would be appropriate for a natural gas refinery. These other ones would more likely use job order costing. So natural gas, imagine natural gas, you can't really distinguish one cubic, whatever it is, you sell gas in cubic meters or whatever. They're all the same units of gas. So the answer there is A. 24, which of the following is uncharacteristic of process costing? So a process costing, several work and process accounts used, that's true. Manufacturing costs are grouped by department rather than job, that's true. Perpetual inventory system is maintained for materials, work in process and finished goods, that's true. Costs are accumulated by job, well, that's in per job order costing, it's not in process costing. So which of the following is uncharacteristic? The answer would be C. 25, Challenger produces two similar products, regular widgets and deluxe widgets. Total factory overhead budget is 675 with 300,000 direct labor hours. So if you want to get your cost per hour there, it takes 665 divided by 300. Deluxe widget production requires 3 direct labor hours per unit, and regular widget requires 2 hours per unit. Using a single plant-wide rate with an allocation based on direct labor hours, the factory overhead that Challenger factory would allocate to deluxe widgets. So it's 675 divided by 300, so you get a rate of 225. Each unit of the deluxe widgets requires 3 hours. So deluxe widget requires 3 hours of direct labor hours. So 58,000 units times 3 times 225 gives you 391,500. So the correct answer is A. 26. Boston factory has budgeted factory overhead of 13,500,000. Budgeted direct labor hours for the year is 10,000. So 13,500,000 divided by 110, by 10 million rather, gives you a rate of 135 per labor hour. If actual labor hours for the month were 350,000, the overhead allocated from A would be, so 350,000 times 135 gives you 472,500. So the answer there is C. Which of the following are actual factory overhead allocation methods? So the allocation methods are plant-wide rate, single, multiple departmental rates, and activity-based costing methods. So the correct answer there is A. All the other ones are interesting, but they're not. They don't include all the methods. So the methods that we did in class were single plant-wide rate, multiple production rate, and activity-based costing. So the correct answer is A. 28. Which of the following is a reason for banks to use activity-based costing? Well, it determines both the amounts to charge and the profitability of services provided. So the best answer there is D. And there is no question 29. You all got question 29 right, because there was no question 29. If selling administrative expenses are allocated different products for decision making, they should be recorded in the financial statements as selling administration are all part of period costs. So they're not part of the cost of the product. So the answer there is C. Okay. So I hope you found a little review of the multiple choice useful. As I had forecasted, you generally did better on the take-home part than the multiple choice part. So going forward, spend more time practicing the multiple choice. And you get your adaptive exercises for each chapter. You've got the All those little mini lectures that I put, I didn't see a lot of traction on those mini lectures where I reviewed the multiple choice questions at the back of each chapter. And also remember, for each chapter, we have practice multiple choice questions as well. So I hope in the next exam to see higher grades on the multiple choice part, and I recommend you do those things. And also doesn't hurt to spend time with the tutors as well. Okay, you all can see in the other neat stuff, I've given you the hours of the tutoring, and they can help you do better on the multiple choice. Right, until next time, adios, au revoir, hasta luego. We shall see you on Tuesday. Be well, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.